The day I publicly declared bankruptcy, my husband stood across the courtroom and told everyone I had destroyed our family. Reporters sat behind me. Neighbors whispered. My daughter was crying beside the door. Thomas Richardson, the man I had loved for 38 years, pointed at me and said, "You could have kept this private." But there was nothing private left to protect. Our money was gone. Our marriage was gone. And the fortune everyone in Savannah believed we had never existed at all. As I signed my name beneath the bankruptcy petition, I looked at my husband and realized something terrifying. The man sitting across from me had spent years pretending we were rich, and I had just become the woman who would expose every lie. Before I tell you how a 40-year marriage ended in a courtroom, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe so we can spend more evenings together. And tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered that someone you loved was living a lie? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Reading your stories always reminds me that none of us are truly alone. When people hear that my husband spent years pretending we were wealthy, they usually assume we were always unhappy. That isn't true. For most of my life, Thomas Richardson was the kind of man women hoped their daughters would marry. I met him in the spring of 1984 at a church picnic outside Savannah. I was 22 years old and working as a receptionist at a dental office. Thomas was 25, sunburned from construction work, wearing worn blue jeans and a Braves cap that had faded from years in the Georgia sun. He wasn't handsome in the movie star sense. He was simply kind. He carried folding chairs for elderly women, played baseball with children, and laughed with his entire body. When he spoke to you, he looked directly into your eyes as if nothing else mattered. My mother told me later, "Carol, that man looks at you like you've already become his home." She was right. We married 14 months later. Our first apartment sat above a hardware store on Abercorn Street. The air conditioner barely worked. The kitchen was so small that if one person opened the refrigerator, the other had to step outside. We were poor. Very poor. But we were happy. Thomas worked for a local construction company during the day and repaired roofs on weekends. I kept our checkbook in a small blue notebook and counted every dollar. Some weeks we ate spaghetti 3 nights in a row. Some months we postponed buying clothes. When our daughter Emily was born, Thomas sold his fishing boat to pay hospital bills. When Michael arrived 3 years later, he worked 16-hour days. He never complained. At night, he would sit beside our bed exhausted and say, "One day we'll have a little house, Carol. Nothing fancy, just ours." And eventually we did. The house on Willow Creek Road wasn't large. 3 bedrooms, white siding, a front porch that creaked whenever someone walked across it, but it was ours. Thomas painted every wall himself. He built Emily a dollhouse in the garage. He taught Michael how to ride a bicycle in our driveway. Every Christmas he climbed onto the roof to hang lights even when his knees began hurting in his 50s. For decades, our life looked ordinary. And honestly, I loved ordinary. Thomas eventually started his own small construction company. Richardson Home Renovations repaired kitchens, added decks, and remodeled bathrooms throughout Savannah. The business never made us rich, but it paid our bills. We took one vacation every summer. We attended church every Sunday. We hosted Thanksgiving dinners. Our children grew up believing they had a good life because they did. Emily became a teacher. Michael moved to Dallas after college to work as an engineer. And when the children left home, Thomas and I entered what I believed would be our peaceful years. We drank coffee on the porch. We walked through Forsyth Park. We talked about retirement. I imagined growing old beside him. Sometimes I think the cruelest changes happen slowly enough that you don't recognize them until years later. The first difference appeared shortly after Thomas turned 60. The construction business had begun slowing down. Younger companies were winning contracts. Material costs increased. Several projects fell through. Thomas never said he was worried, but I could see it. He spent more time sitting silently in his office. He watched television late at night. He stopped fishing. He stopped laughing. Then one afternoon, I walked into the living room and found him watching videos on his phone. Men my husband's age stood beside expensive cars. They toured enormous houses. They talked about success, wealth, and legacy. Thomas watched them for hours. "They're all younger than me," he said quietly. "So," I asked, "so they've accomplished something?" I remember laughing. "You've built houses for 30 years. You've raised 2 wonderful children." He didn't smile. "Nobody sees that." At first, I thought it was simply retirement anxiety. Many people struggle when they begin growing older. But Thomas started saying things he had never said before. "We should have made more money. We should have invested. We should have bought a larger house. People probably think we failed." Failed. That word appeared constantly. I didn't understand it. Our mortgage was nearly paid off. We had retirement savings. Our children loved us. We had good health. What exactly had failed? One evening, we attended a dinner at church. An old friend had recently sold his business and purchased a waterfront home. Everyone congratulated him. On the drive home, Thomas said almost nothing. Finally, he spoke. "Do you think people look at me and see a man who didn't accomplish enough?" I turned toward him. "Thomas, nobody thinks that." "But what if they do?" I remember touching his hand. "We don't need to impress anyone." He pulled his hand away. That was unusual. Very unusual. The man who had held my hand through funerals, surgeries, childbirth, and nearly 40 years of marriage suddenly seemed far away. A few weeks later, Emily visited for dinner. She noticed it too. "Dad seems different," she told me while washing dishes. "He's just stressed." "About work?" "I think so." Emily dried her hands. "Maybe he feels old." I considered that. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps men sometimes tie their identity to their work. Thomas had spent decades building houses and solving problems. Maybe the slowing business frightened him. Maybe he needed time. Maybe he needed reassurance. So I tried. I told him how proud I was. I reminded him what he had accomplished. I planned small weekend trips. I encouraged him to spend time with Michael, but nothing seemed to reach him. Instead, he became increasingly interested in appearances. He bought new shirts, expensive shoes, a watch far nicer than anything he'd ever owned. When I asked about the price, he smiled. "Don't worry about it." That sentence bothered me, because for 38 years, we had always worried about things together. One Saturday morning, I found him standing in front of our house taking photographs with his phone. "What are you doing?" I asked. He looked embarrassed. "Just taking pictures." "For what?" He hesitated. "I started a social media page." I laughed. "You hate social media. People use it for business." I walked closer. His profile picture showed him wearing a suit he rarely used. His biography read, "Builder, investor, entrepreneur." Investor, entrepreneur. I looked at him. "Thomas, when did you become an investor?" He smiled awkwardly. "It sounds professional." I wanted to argue. Instead, I let it go. Because after nearly 4 decades of marriage, you learn to pick your battles. But that evening after Thomas went to bed, I sat alone in our kitchen. The house felt strangely quiet. The clock above the stove ticked. The refrigerator hummed. And for the first time in my marriage, I experienced a feeling I couldn't explain. Not fear, not anger, something else. As though the man sleeping upstairs had quietly become someone I no longer fully knew. I didn't realize then that this small change would eventually destroy everything we had spent 40 years building. I only knew that my husband had begun looking at our life as if it wasn't enough. And sometimes, when a person stops appreciating what they have, they begin chasing something that doesn't exist. The first expensive thing Thomas bought was a watch. At least, that was what he told me. It appeared one Tuesday evening while we were eating meatloaf at the kitchen table. He rolled up his sleeve to reach for the salt, and there it was, a silver watch with a dark blue face that looked far too expensive for our household. I stared at it. "That's new." He glanced down casually. "Oh, this I got a good deal." "How good?" He smiled. "Just a few $100s. I knew my husband. After 38 years, I could hear dishonesty before the words even finished leaving his mouth. Thomas had never cared about watches. For decades, he wore the same simple Timex that Emily bought him for Father's Day. He only replaced it after the band broke. Now he suddenly owned something that looked like it belonged to a banker or a corporate executive. I wanted to press further. Instead, I finished dinner in silence. That became a pattern. Little changes, small purchases, new shoes, designer sunglasses, expensive cologne, a leather jacket. Nothing individually catastrophic, but together they felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't understand. One Saturday morning, I found Thomas standing in front of our neighbor's Mercedes. He was taking photographs. "What are you doing?" I asked. He nearly dropped his phone. "Oh, Mr. Jenkins said I could." "You asked to photograph his car," Thomas laughed awkwardly. "It's for social media." The words still sounded strange coming from him. For most of our marriage, Thomas barely used email. Now he spoke about followers, engagement, content, personal branding. I didn't even know where he had learned those phrases. That evening, while he showered, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I normally never touched his phone. Marriage had always meant trust between us, but the screen lit up with the notification. "Great post. People are loving the luxury angle." Luxury angle. My stomach tightened. When Thomas returned, I asked carefully, "Who's Danielle?" He froze. "A marketing consultant." "For your company?" "Sort of." "How much are you paying her?" He opened the refrigerator. "Not much." That answer bothered me more than the amount. Not much could mean anything. For years, we had discussed every major expense together. Now conversations ended with vague answers. A week later, Emily came for lunch. As we sat on the porch, she suddenly laughed. "Dad's Instagram is wild." I nearly spilled my tea. "His what?" She showed me her phone. There was Thomas, standing beside the Mercedes, sitting at an expensive restaurant downtown, posing in front of Savannah Harbor. One photograph showed him inside a private country club. The caption read, "Success isn't about luck, it's about vision." Another said, "Building wealth means thinking differently." I stared at the screen. The comments underneath shocked me. "Congratulations. Inspiring. Goals. Living the dream." People actually believed it. Emily frowned. "When did Dad become some kind of businessman influencer?" "I don't know." "He told people he's expanding the company." "He did?" She nodded. "He mentioned investments, too." Investments. Again that word. That evening, I confronted Thomas. "You told people we're investors." He sighed. "It's networking." "No, Thomas, it's lying." He sat down heavily. "You don't understand." "Then explain it." He rubbed his forehead. People only respect success. We've been respected our entire lives. Because they think I'm successful. I stared at him. No, because you're a good man. His expression changed, almost sadness. Good men don't get remembered. That sentence frightened me, because it sounded as though my husband had begun measuring his worth through strangers. Over the next several months, the changes accelerated. Thomas rented a luxury car for a weekend. He told me it was for a client meeting. Instead, I later discovered dozens of photographs online. He wore a suit, held coffee cups beside the vehicle, stood outside expensive hotels. The captions made it appear as if he owned everything. People admired him. Former classmates commented. Local business owners followed him. Even distant relatives began asking questions. Emily called one evening. Mom, are you guys doing really well financially? What do you mean? Dad posted pictures from the golf club. I looked toward the living room where Thomas sat editing photographs. No, sweetheart. She hesitated. Because Michael thinks Dad might be exaggerating. Michael called 2 days later. Dad says he's investing in real estate. He told you that? Yeah. I felt embarrassed. No, honey. There was silence. Finally, Michael said, Is everything okay? At that moment, I truly believed it was. Strange, yes. Concerning, certainly. But dangerous, no. I thought perhaps Thomas was going through some late-life crisis. Perhaps he wanted to feel younger. More important. More accomplished. I still believed the man I married existed underneath all this. Then came the golf club. Thomas had never played golf. Not once. Yet one Friday morning, he announced he had a meeting. He returned that afternoon wearing golf clothes. His cheeks were red from the sun. How was your meeting? Productive. At a golf course. He shrugged. Business happens everywhere. That night, I looked online. There he was, standing beside 3 businessmen I didn't recognize. Caption, Surround yourself with winners. I felt anger for the first time. Not because of the photographs, because he was becoming someone else. Someone who spoke in slogans. Someone who cared about appearances. Someone who no longer sat beside me on the porch. One evening after dinner, I asked him directly, Are you unhappy with our life? He looked surprised. What? Our house, our marriage, our family? He stared into his coffee. No? Then why are you pretending we're people we aren't? He became quiet. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. Finally, he spoke. You know what it's like when people ask how business is going. What? They don't want the truth. What truth? He looked at me. The company is slowing down. My heart softened. For months, I had suspected something. Thomas, I spent 40 years building that business. I know. And now younger guys are getting the jobs. I reached for his hand. We'll manage. He pulled away. I don't want people feeling sorry for me. Nobody feels sorry for you. I wanted to say it. Instead, I asked, So pretending to be wealthy fixes that? His face hardened. You think I'm pretending? Aren't you? He stood up. You've never understood ambition. The words hit me harder than they should have, because for nearly 40 years, we had always been on the same side. Suddenly, it felt like there were 2 versions of my husband, the man who built our home, and the man chasing strangers on the internet. A few days later, I opened our mailbox. Inside was a credit card statement. The balance was nearly $8,000. My hands began to shake. The card was unfamiliar. I carried it into the kitchen. Thomas walked in minutes later. What is this? His face changed. It isn't what you think. $8,000? I'll handle it. With what money? His jaw tightened. You don't need to worry. But I did worry, because for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't simply watching my husband change. I was beginning to realize that his new life, the expensive clothes, the photographs, the rented luxury was costing far more than I had ever imagined. And somewhere inside me, a quiet voice had started asking a question I wasn't ready to answer. If Thomas was willing to lie to everyone else, how much had he already lied to me? The first dinner party happened in October. Until that evening, Thomas had never invited business clients into our home. Our house on Willow Creek Road had always been a place for family dinners, church friends, and birthday celebrations. We owned mismatched dining chairs, faded curtains, and a living room sofa that Emily jokingly called the Survivor because it had endured 30 years of children, dogs, and grandchildren. Suddenly, all of that became unacceptable. One Saturday morning, Thomas walked into the kitchen carrying a notebook. We're hosting a dinner. I looked up from my coffee. A dinner. Several business people. From work. He hesitated. Some investors, a few entrepreneurs. I nearly laughed. What investors? He ignored the question. We need to make the house look nicer. Our house is fine. He shook his head. No, Carol. It looks old. The words hurt more than I expected. This was the house where we raised our children. The kitchen where Emily baked cookies. The hallway where Michael measured his height every birthday. The porch where Thomas once told me he loved me. Old, perhaps. But it was our life. Within days, furniture began arriving. A modern dining table, decorative lamps, expensive rugs, new artwork. At first, I assumed Thomas had purchased them. Then I noticed small tags attached underneath. Rental company labels. I stared at one. Thomas, these are rented. He avoided my eyes. It's temporary. Why, appearances matter. That phrase had become his religion. Appearances matter, success matters, image matters. Meanwhile, the actual life we had built together seemed to matter less each day. A week before the dinner, he handed me several shopping bags. What is this? Dresses. I opened one. The price tag alone nearly made me drop it. Thomas, absolutely not. You need something elegant. I have clothes. Not for this. I looked at him. What exactly are we pretending to be? His face hardened. We're not pretending. The answer frightened me because I believed he actually meant it. The night of the dinner arrived. I barely recognized my own house. Candles, fresh flowers, catered food, wine bottles far more expensive than anything we normally bought. Thomas wore a dark blue suit. He looked younger, confident, almost excited. As guests arrived, I realized most of them were strangers. A real estate agent, a financial advisor, 2 local business owners, a retired doctor, several couples I had never met. Thomas introduced me with a smile. This is my wife, Carol. Then he added something that made my stomach tighten. She manages our investments. Our investments. I forced a smile. One woman asked, Do you mostly invest in property? I stared at her. Before I could answer, Thomas spoke. We've diversified over the years. Diversified, I wanted to interrupt. Instead, I remained silent. The entire evening felt like a performance. Thomas spoke about future projects. He mentioned business opportunities. He talked about retirement income. At one point, he said, Financial freedom changes everything. I nearly dropped my wine glass. Because our retirement savings were modest. Our income was stable but limited. We were not financially free. We were simply comfortable. Yet everyone around the table nodded with admiration. One of the men asked, What's your secret? Thomas smiled. Vision. Vision. The same word from his social media posts. As the evening continued, I noticed something unsettling. Thomas seemed happier than he had in years. People listened to him, admired him, asked his advice. For the first time in a long while, he looked alive. And part of me felt guilty for wanting to take that away. After the guests left, I helped clear the dishes. The house felt strangely quiet. Thomas stood in the living room smiling. "That went well?" I set down a plate. "You lied all night." "I inspired people." "You told them we invest." "We do have retirement accounts." "You told them we're financially independent." He became irritated. "Why are you always negative?" Negative! That word shocked me. I had supported this man for nearly 4 decades. I had worked extra jobs, balanced budgets, raised children, stood beside him during difficult years. Now questioning obvious lies made me negative. I went upstairs without answering. Over the next several months, the dinners continued. Sometimes at our house, sometimes at expensive restaurants. Thomas took photographs constantly. He posted pictures of wine glasses, steaks, luxury hotels, golf courses. The captions grew bolder. "Success requires courage. Build wealth intentionally. Never settle." People responded enthusiastically. His followers increased. Local business owners invited him to events. Church members asked financial questions. Neighbors complimented him. One afternoon, our neighbor Linda said, "Carol, you and Thomas must be doing incredibly well." I forced a smile. "We do all right." She laughed. "That's not what his Facebook says." That night, I confronted him again. "People think we're wealthy. So, it's not true. Why does it matter?" I looked at him in disbelief. "Because we're lying." He became quiet. Finally, he said something that stayed with me. "People don't respect ordinary anymore." I answered softly, "I do." He looked away. The Christmas season arrived. Emily and her husband came for dinner. Michael flew in from Dallas. For a few hours, our family felt normal again. Then Emily asked an innocent question. "Dad, when did you join the golf club?" Thomas smiled. "Oh, a while ago." I looked up. Golf club. We had never discussed any membership. Michael frowned. "The annual fees there are expensive." Thomas shrugged. "It's good for networking." After dinner, Michael helped me wash dishes. He lowered his voice. "Mom, something feels off." "What do you mean?" "Dad talks like he's rich." I remained silent. Michael continued. "He asked me if I wanted investment opportunities." I almost laughed. "Your father. He also said he's thinking about buying property." The room suddenly felt cold. Buying property. With what money? When Michael went upstairs, I walked into the living room. Thomas sat scrolling through his phone. "Are you planning to buy property?" He didn't look up. "I'm exploring opportunities." "With what money?" He finally looked at me. "You always assume the worst." "No, I assume reality." His eyes narrowed. "Maybe reality can change." I stood there for several seconds. The Christmas tree glowed beside us. Family photographs covered the walls. Pictures of birthdays, graduations, vacations. Decades of ordinary happiness. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. Thomas was no longer embarrassed by the lies. He was building his entire identity around them. The rented furniture, the expensive dinners, the social media posts, the golf club, the wealthy friends. It had all become a new version of himself, and I was the only person who still remembered who he used to be. 3 days after Christmas, I found an envelope hidden inside a kitchen drawer. Inside was a bill. Nearly $6,000. Catering services, furniture rentals, event expenses. My hands began shaking because for the first time, I wasn't looking at photographs. I wasn't looking at social media. I wasn't looking at appearances. I was looking at the actual cost of Thomas's new life, and I had the terrible feeling that this was only the beginning. I did not sleep the night I found the $6,000 bill. Thomas had already gone upstairs. The television downstairs had gone dark, and the only light in the kitchen came from the small lamp above the sink. I sat alone at the table, holding the invoice in my trembling hands. Furniture rentals, catering services, event expenses, late fees. My husband had spent thousands of dollars creating the illusion that we were wealthy, and suddenly, I no longer believed this was simply a phase. The next morning, I placed the bill beside his coffee cup. Thomas walked into the kitchen, stopped and stared at it. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I said quietly, "How much debt are we in?" He sat down. "It's temporary." "That wasn't my question." He rubbed his forehead. "I'll take care of it." "Thomas, answer me." He looked tired, older. For just a moment, I saw the man I had married. Then he said the words that frightened me. "You wouldn't understand." I almost laughed. For nearly 40 years, I had balanced our accounts. I paid our bills, prepared our taxes, managed our household budget. If anyone understood money, it was me. "I deserve to know." His jaw tightened. "Everything is under control." "No, it isn't." He stood up. "I'm late." And then he walked out. That afternoon, I opened our desk drawer. For years, we had kept our financial documents there. Insurance papers, mortgage statements, retirement accounts, tax records. But several folders were missing. At first, I thought Thomas had reorganized them. Then I discovered a locked metal box in the closet. My husband had never locked anything from me, not once. That frightened me more than the box itself. When Thomas came home, I pointed toward it. "What is in there?" He froze. "Business papers." "Why are they locked?" "They're private." The word private felt almost insulting. Private. After 38 years, after raising children together, after surviving illnesses, layoffs, and funerals, now we had secrets. That evening, I called Emily. I hadn't intended to worry her, but I needed someone to talk to. "Mom, are you okay?" "No." She became quiet. "What happened?" I explained the bills, the parties, the expenses, the social media. Emily listened carefully. Finally, she said, "Have you seen the accounts?" "What accounts? Dad's accounts?" "No." "Maybe you should." Her words stayed with me. 3 days later, Thomas left early for a meeting. I decided to clean his office. At least, that was the excuse I gave myself. His desk had become increasingly disorganized. Receipts, business cards, magazines, printed social media statistics. I opened one drawer. Nothing. Another. Nothing. Then I found a folder. My name was written across the front. Carol Richardson. My hands immediately became cold. Inside were loan documents, bank statements, credit applications. I sat down. One credit card had a balance of nearly $12,000. Another carried more than $8,000. There was a business line of credit, a personal loan, several overdue notices. I could barely breathe. But the worst document sat at the bottom. A home equity loan. Our house. Our house had been used as collateral. I stared at the pages. My signature appeared near the bottom, except it wasn't mine, at least not entirely. The name looked like mine. The handwriting looked similar. But I had never signed those papers. Never. I checked again. My signature appeared on another form, and another. My vision blurred. I called Thomas immediately. He answered on the third ring. What? My voice shook. What did you do? What are you talking about? The loans. Silence. Thomas. It's complicated. No, it's criminal. Lower your voice. I didn't sign these. Several seconds passed. Finally, he spoke quietly. I was going to tell you. When things improved, I felt my knees weaken. You forged my signature. I had no choice. No choice. The bank wouldn't approve everything otherwise. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't social media. This wasn't pretending. This wasn't rented furniture. My husband had used my name, my credit, my future, our home. I whispered, "How much?" He didn't answer. "Thomas, how much debt?" His voice sounded defeated. "About 180,000. The room began spinning. $180,000. I sat on the floor, the papers scattered around me. "Please come home," I said. He didn't. Instead, he stayed away until after dark. When he finally entered the house, neither of us knew how to begin. He sat at the kitchen table. I remained standing. "Why?" He stared at his hands. The business slowed down. "I know. I thought things would recover. And I needed cash. Then why the cars, the dinners, the parties?" He finally looked at me. "Because nobody invests in failure." The sentence stunned me. He continued. "I needed people to think I was successful. So you borrowed money. I needed opportunities. You lied. I was trying to save everything." I shook my head. "No, you were trying to save your image." His eyes filled with anger. "You have no idea what it's like." "What?" "To spend 40 years building something and watch it disappear." I sat down opposite him. "I would have stood beside you." "I didn't want your pity." "You had my love." He looked away. The silence between us felt enormous. The next morning, I called an attorney. Not because I wanted a divorce, not because I wanted revenge, because I needed to understand what had happened. The attorney reviewed several documents. She became very quiet. Finally, she asked, "Mrs. Richardson, did you sign these?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Absolutely." She folded her hands. "You need to understand the seriousness of this." My heart pounded. "What does this mean?" "It means your husband may have committed fraud." I felt physically ill. Fraud. Not mistakes. Not poor decisions. Fraud. She continued. "If these debts cannot be paid, creditors may pursue marital assets. Our house. Potentially. My retirement. Potentially." I stared at her. "What should I do?" She answered carefully. "First, gather every financial document you can find. And then," she looked directly into my eyes, "protect yourself. Protect yourself. For 40 years, my job had been protecting our family, protecting Thomas, protecting our children, protecting our marriage. Now someone was telling me to protect myself." That evening, I returned home and found Thomas sitting alone in the living room. His phone rested beside him. The social media accounts, the photographs, the expensive image. Everything suddenly seemed ridiculous. I sat across from him. Did you use my signature more than once? He didn't answer. Thomas. Quietly, he nodded. How many times? His voice barely emerged. Several. I closed my eyes because at that moment, something inside me broke. Not my trust. That had already been damaged. Not my marriage. That was still standing. What broke was the belief that my husband would never truly harm me. And once that belief disappears, you begin seeing the person sitting across from you differently. For the first time in 38 years, I was afraid of what my husband had become. And deep inside, another fear had begun growing. If he had hidden this much already, what else had I not discovered? For 3 days after discovering the forged signatures, Thomas and I barely spoke. We moved around each other like strangers sharing the same house. He slept in the guest room. I spent most evenings sitting on the porch alone, listening to the distant traffic and wondering how an ordinary marriage could unravel so completely. The attorney's words continued echoing inside my mind. Protect yourself. I hated those words, because protecting myself somehow felt like abandoning my husband. Yet every time I looked at the loan papers, I remembered that he had already abandoned me first. The following Monday, while sorting through documents, I found a business card tucked inside one of Thomas's folders. Danielle Brooks, Strategic Brand Consultant. The name immediately caught my attention. It appeared on several invoices, monthly payments, consulting fees, photography services, content management. The total amount exceeded $15,000. I stared at the figures. Thomas had spent thousands paying someone I had never even met. That evening, I placed the invoices on the kitchen table. Who is Danielle Brooks? Thomas immediately became uncomfortable. A consultant. What kind? Marketing. For what? He hesitated. My image. I almost laughed. Your image? It's complicated. No, Thomas. Explain it. He stood up. I don't want to fight. Neither do I. He walked toward the hallway. Leave it alone. But I couldn't. The next morning, after spending most of the night awake, I called the number on the business card. A woman answered. Danielle Brooks speaking. My throat suddenly tightened. Hello, my name is Carol Richardson. There was a pause. Oh. Just one word. Oh. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. You know who I am? Another pause. Mrs. Richardson, I thought your husband said... He said what? Silence. Finally, she said softly, perhaps we should meet. 2 days later, I sat inside a small coffee shop downtown. Danielle arrived exactly on time. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her early 40s, professionally dressed, carrying a laptop bag. She sat carefully. You've never met me. No. She looked uncomfortable. I assumed your husband had explained everything. He hasn't explained anything. Danielle took a deep breath. What exactly do you know? I looked directly at her. I know my husband has debts. She nodded. I know he forged documents. She looked down. I know he paid you thousands of dollars. She folded her hands. What do you want to know? Everything. I wanted to know everything. Instead, I asked one question. What do you do for him? She hesitated. I help professionals build personal brands. I stared at her. My husband owns a small construction company. I know. He isn't a celebrity. No. He isn't wealthy. Danielle looked uncomfortable. No. I leaned forward. Then why does everyone believe he is? She finally answered. Because that's what he wanted. The next hour changed my understanding of my husband completely. Danielle opened her laptop. She showed me photographs. Hundreds of them. Thomas beside luxury vehicles. Thomas inside expensive restaurants. Thomas holding wine glasses. Thomas standing near yachts. Thomas sitting in hotel lobbies. None of them were real. The cars were rented. The restaurants were carefully selected. The hotels were visited for photographs only. Some trips lasted less than an hour. Danielle explained everything. People buy success. I stared at her. What does that mean? If people believe you're successful, opportunities appear. Opportunities for what? Business, clients, investors. I looked at photograph after photograph. My husband smiled in every single one, confident, successful, powerful. Yet I recognized something that strangers could not. His smile wasn't real. It looked almost desperate. How long has this been happening? About 2 years. 2 years. 2 entire years. While we ate dinner together, celebrated birthdays, visited our children, attended church. My husband had been living a second life. Danielle opened another folder. Social media strategies, post schedules, audience growth, image positioning, luxury branding. My stomach turned. One document contained phrases Thomas should use: success mindset, financial freedom, building wealth, legacy. Those same phrases he had repeated at home. They had become part of his identity. I finally asked the question that frightened me. Did you know we were in debt? Danielle became very quiet. I knew he had financial problems. How bad? She looked away. He said everything would improve. I nodded slowly, because that was what Thomas always said. Everything will improve. Then Danielle said something unexpected. He was scared. I frowned. Scared? He talked about failing. I remained silent. He said people respected successful men. I felt tears forming, because underneath the lies, the parties, and the photographs, I suddenly recognized something: fear. My husband had been terrified. Terrified of aging, terrified of losing his business, terrified of becoming ordinary, terrified that people would see him as unsuccessful. Danielle continued. He said his children had accomplished more than he had. That surprised me. Emily was a teacher. Michael was an engineer. Neither had ever judged him. He felt left behind. I looked out the window. Traffic moved slowly outside. People carried shopping bags. Life continued. Meanwhile, my marriage was collapsing inside a coffee shop. Finally, I asked the question I had avoided. Was there another woman? Danielle looked genuinely surprised. No, nothing. No, I believed her. Oddly enough, that answer didn't comfort me, because an affair would have been easier to understand. This was something else. My husband had fallen in love with an imaginary version of himself. Before leaving, Danielle reached into her bag. I think you should have these. She handed me a folder. Inside were invoices, contracts, photographs, content plans, and one document that made my hands tremble. Estimated return on image investment. The projection assumed Thomas would eventually attract investors and wealthy clients because of his online presence. It wasn't reality. It was hope, expensive hope. As I stood to leave, Danielle spoke softly. He loves you. I looked at her. Then why did he do this? She answered quietly. I think he stopped loving himself. I drove home in silence. The folder sat beside me. By the time I reached our neighborhood, the sun had begun setting. The house looked exactly the same. The porch, the windows, the flower beds. Yet I felt as though I had returned to someone else's life. Thomas sat in the living room, television on, phone in his hand. I stood in the doorway. I met Danielle. His face turned pale. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't want you involved." I placed the folder on the table. "I'm your wife." He looked at the papers. Then he looked at me. For the first time in months, I saw genuine shame in his eyes. Not anger, not defensiveness. Shame. But before he could speak, the doorbell rang. Thomas frowned. "We aren't expecting anyone." Neither of us moved. The bell rang again, this time louder. Thomas opened the front door. Two men stood outside. One held documents. "Mr. Richardson." My husband nodded. The man handed him an envelope. "We've been trying to reach you." Thomas's face lost all color. The men left. I looked at the papers in his hands. "What is it?" He didn't answer. "Thomas." His voice barely emerged. "It's a collection notice." "How much?" He looked at me. $32,000. I felt the room begin to spin again, because suddenly I realized something terrible. The debts were not finished appearing. The lies were not finished unraveling, and whatever my husband had hidden from me, it was still getting worse. The collection notice sat on our kitchen table for 2 days. Neither Thomas nor I touched it. It lay between us during breakfast dinner and long stretches of silence like a third person living inside our house. $32,000. I had stopped asking how much debt remained because every answer seemed worse than the last. The following Sunday, I called Emily. "Honey, can you come over?" She immediately heard something in my voice. "Mom, what happened?" "Please come." She arrived within an hour. Her husband stayed in the car, sensing that this was a family conversation. Thomas sat in his recliner, pretending to watch football. Emily hugged me. Then she saw my face. "Mom." I handed her the collection notice. She read it. Her expression changed. "What is this?" Nobody answered. She looked at her father. "Dad." Thomas kept staring at the television. Emily's voice became firmer. "Dad." Finally, he muted the television. "It's being handled." She looked at him in disbelief. $32,000 is being handled. It's complicated. I almost closed my eyes. Everything had become complicated. Every lie, every bill, every question. Emily sat beside me. "Mom, how bad is it?" Before I could answer, Thomas spoke. "Your mother is overreacting." That sentence changed something inside me. Overreacting after discovering forged signatures, hidden loans, massive debts. I looked directly at my husband. "Tell her." He remained silent. I stood up. "Tell your daughter the truth." Emily stared at him, and for the first time in her life, I saw fear in her eyes. Because children reach a certain age when they suddenly realize their parents are human, and sometimes very flawed. Thomas finally spoke. "The business had problems." Emily nodded slowly. "Okay." "I borrowed money." "How much?" Silence. "Dad, how much?" He looked away. "I don't know exactly." I heard Emily inhale sharply. You don't know. I'll figure it out. She stood. No, Dad. You needed to figure it out before now. The room became very quiet. Thomas looked wounded, but Emily continued. Did you forge Mom's signature? He didn't answer. That silence became the answer. My daughter sat back down. Tears appeared in her eyes. Oh my God. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, Emily whispered, Michael needs to know. Thomas immediately shook his head. No, he deserves the truth. He'll overreact. I almost laughed. Apparently, honesty itself had become an overreaction. Emily stepped outside and called her brother. I remained in the kitchen. Thomas sat alone. After a while, he said quietly, You turned them against me. I looked at him. No. You told them everything. You forged my signature. I was trying to save this family. I felt anger rise. No. You were trying to save your image. His face hardened. You don't understand what it's like. Then explain it. He stood. I spent 40 years building something. And I spent 40 years building this family. Neither of us spoke again. That evening, Michael called. His voice sounded calm, almost too calm. Mom, I'm here. Is it true? I closed my eyes. Yes. He was silent for several seconds. Finally, he asked, Are you safe? The question shocked me. Safe? With Dad? I looked toward the living room. Thomas sat alone, suddenly older, smaller. No, sweetheart, he's never hurt me. Michael exhaled. I'm coming home. You don't have to. I'm already booking the flight. 2 days later, Michael walked through our front door. At 33, he looked remarkably like his father had looked years earlier. Same height, same eyes, same stubborn expression. Thomas hugged him. Michael barely returned it. We sat around the dining table. No television, no distractions, no lies. Michael looked directly at his father. How much debt? Thomas stared at the table. I don't know. Michael's voice remained controlled. How can you not know? There are business loans. What kind? Personal loans. What else? Thomas remained silent. Michael leaned forward. What else? Credit cards. How much? I don't know. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Every answer revealed another problem. Loans, interest, missed payments, late notices, outstanding balances. Emily cried quietly. I felt numb. Then Michael asked the question nobody wanted to ask. Can they take the house? The room became silent. Thomas didn't answer. I did. Possibly. Emily covered her mouth. The house. The place where both children had grown up. The place where birthdays happened. Christmas mornings, graduations, family dinners. Suddenly, it wasn't safe. Michael stood and walked outside. I followed him. He stood beside the porch railing. He lied to all of us. I nodded. He looked toward the house. I don't recognize him. Neither did I. That evening after dinner, someone knocked on the door. The sound startled everyone. Thomas opened it. A man stood outside holding papers. He introduced himself as a representative from a financing company. He spoke politely, very politely, too politely. The conversation lasted only minutes. When Thomas returned, his face had turned pale. What was that? He sat down. Another account. Michael crossed his arms. How much? Thomas whispered. 17,000. Emily began crying. I felt nothing. No shock. No fear. Because I had reached the point where numbers stopped meaning anything. 30,000, 17,000, 100,000. They had all become pieces of the same nightmare. Later that night, Emily sat beside me in the kitchen. Her eyes were red. Mom? Yes. How long have you known? Not long. She looked down. I thought Dad was successful. I nodded. So did everyone else. She began crying again. He looked so happy online. Those words broke my heart because Thomas had succeeded. People believed him. His children, friends, neighbors, church members, everyone. Everyone except the people who lived with him. Around midnight, Michael knocked on the guest room door. Thomas opened it. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough. You lied. I know. You used Mom. I was desperate. You should have asked us. I didn't want you seeing me as a failure. There was silence. Then Michael said something I will never forget. Dad, I never needed you to be rich. The hallway became quiet. A few moments later, Michael walked away. Thomas remained standing in the doorway. For the first time in months, I saw him crying. Real tears. Not self-pity. Not anger. Just sadness. But sadness could not erase debts. Sadness could not restore trust. The following morning, I woke early. The house was quiet. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. The fear inside me was changing. I was no longer afraid of discovering more lies. I expected them. I was no longer afraid of the debt. The numbers had become too large. What frightened me now was something much deeper. I was beginning to imagine a future without my husband. Not because I wanted one, because I might need one. At 9 o'clock, the doorbell rang again. This time, a certified letter arrived. Thomas opened it. His hands trembled. Michael watched. Emily stood beside me. Thomas looked up. His voice cracked. The mortgage company. The entire room went silent, because suddenly every single person in that house understood the same thing. We weren't just losing money, we might be losing our home. The letter from the mortgage company remained unopened on the dining room table for nearly an hour. No one wanted to touch it. No one wanted to hear what it might say. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the family photographs hanging on the wall. Emily at her high school graduation. Michael holding his engineering diploma. Thomas and me standing in front of our church on our 25th anniversary. 38 years of memories surrounded us, and suddenly all of it felt fragile. Michael finally spoke. Open it. Thomas stared at the envelope. Maybe later. No, Michael said firmly. Now. My husband looked at me. For years, he had always looked to me during difficult moments. I had always been the one who calmed him, encouraged him, helped him. This time, I said nothing. Slowly, Thomas opened the letter. His hands trembled. He read silently. Then his face lost all color. Emily whispered, Dad. He lowered the paper. We missed 3 payments. I felt the air leave my lungs. 3 payments. The mortgage had always been sacred to me. No matter how difficult life became, we paid our mortgage. When the children were young, when Thomas first started his company, during recessions, during illnesses, the house had always come first. I looked at him. How? He rubbed his eyes. I used the money elsewhere. What money? The business needed cash. Michael shook his head. No, your image needed cash. Thomas didn't answer. The letter explained that foreclosure proceedings could begin if the account wasn't brought current. Foreclosure. The word seemed unreal. This house wasn't simply property. It was our life. Emily began crying again. I grew up here. I reached for her hand. So did your brother. Thomas stood suddenly. I'm fixing this. Michael laughed bitterly. How? Nobody answered. The next few days became unbearable. Creditors called. Letters arrived. Thomas spent hours on the phone. Emily extended her stay. Michael delayed his flight home. Nobody trusted leaving me alone. On Wednesday afternoon, Thomas approached me in the kitchen. There's a charity gala Saturday night. I stared at him. What? He looked exhausted. Several business owners will be there. Thomas, I need contacts. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our house might be taken. I know. Our children know everything. I know. And you're worried about a gala. His voice rose. I'm trying to save us. No. I stood. You're trying to save your reputation. His face hardened. If I lose those relationships, you already lost your family. The silence afterward felt painful. Emily entered the kitchen. She had heard everything. Dad, please don't do this. Thomas looked at his daughter. I have to. She shook her head. No, you don't. But he had already decided. Saturday evening arrived. I had no intention of attending. I had barely slept all week. The thought of standing beside Thomas while he pretended everything was fine made me physically sick. Then he surprised me. I need you there. I looked up. Why? People expect us together. That sentence told me everything. Not because he needed me, because he needed the appearance of me. Emily immediately spoke. Mom shouldn't go. Thomas ignored her. I looked at him. If I go, I won't lie. He hesitated. Fine. For the first time in months, I believed he understood. I was wrong. The gala took place inside a historic hotel downtown. Beautiful chandeliers, elegant tables, expensive wine, live music. Everything Thomas loved. Everything I had begun to hate. As we entered, people greeted him warmly. Thomas, good to see you. How's business? He smiled. Very busy. My stomach tightened. Very busy. Another lie. A local businessman approached us. I saw your recent posts. You're doing incredibly well. Thomas laughed. We've been fortunate. We, always we, as though I had helped build the illusion. Dinner began. Speeches followed. People donated money, networked, discussed investments, and Thomas became the man from social media again. Confident, successful, admired. For a moment, I almost wondered if the past several weeks had been a nightmare. Then reality walked through the door. A man in his 50s entered the ballroom. He wore a dark suit. He carried a folder. His eyes scanned the room. Eventually, they landed on Thomas. I saw my husband freeze. The man approached. Mr. Richardson. Several people turned. Thomas forced a smile. Good evening. The man remained professional. We've been attempting to contact you. The room became quiet. Thomas whispered, "This isn't the place." The man nodded. "Perhaps not, but you've ignored every letter." People nearby stopped talking. I could hear silverware resting against plates. The man continued, "Our office requires immediate payment." Thomas's face turned pale. One of the guests looked confused. "Everything okay?" Thomas forced a laugh. "Just a misunderstanding." The man disagreed. "No, sir, it isn't." I stood completely still. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. The man handed Thomas several documents. "You have 10 days. And then he walked away. Nobody spoke. One woman quietly excused herself. Another man avoided eye contact. The illusion had cracked. Finally, Thomas looked at me. I saw panic, fear, humiliation, and for one brief moment, I felt sorry for him. Then he did something I will never forget. He looked at the table, looked at the guests, and said, "My wife handles the finances." The words struck me like a slap. Several people looked toward me. I couldn't speak. Thomas continued, "She didn't tell me things had gotten this bad." Emily, who had arrived later to support me, stood up immediately. "Dad," the entire room became silent. I looked at my husband. 38 years. 38 years of loyalty. And at the worst moment of his life, he offered me as the sacrifice. I stood slowly. My hands were shaking. My voice trembled. But I spoke. "No." The room remained silent. I looked directly at Thomas. "No more." His face changed. "Carol, you made these choices. Not here. Exactly here." Tears filled my eyes. "I spent 38 years protecting you." The room had become completely quiet. "I protected your pride, your business, your feelings." Thomas whispered, "Please." I shook my head. "Our children know the truth." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. I continued, "The debts are real." Thomas closed his eyes. "The loans are real." He lowered his head. "And I didn't create them." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The illusion that had taken 2 years to build collapsed in less than 60 seconds. Emily walked to my side. She took my hand. For the first time all evening, I felt steady. Thomas remained seated, small, defeated. The successful businessman from social media had disappeared. Only my husband remained. As we walked toward the exit, he spoke quietly. "Carol." I stopped. His voice cracked. "You're humiliating me." I looked at him for several seconds, and then I said the words that had been growing inside me for months. "No, Thomas." I felt tears running down my face. "I'm just refusing to humiliate myself anymore." Emily and I walked out together. Behind us, I heard whispers, chairs moving, conversations beginning, and I realized something important. The people inside that ballroom were not watching a wealthy man lose his reputation. They were watching a lie finally die. But when I reached home later that night, another envelope was waiting in the mailbox. A certified letter, addressed to me. Not Thomas, me. And when I opened it, I discovered that my nightmare was about to become much worse. I opened the certified letter at the kitchen table. Emily stood beside me. Michael leaned against the counter. Thomas remained near the window, staring outside, as though refusing to look at another piece of bad news might somehow make it disappear. The letter was from a law office. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. The language was formal, cold, legal. Then I reached the words that made my hands begin to shake. Notice of personal liability. My name. Only my name. Not Thomas Richardson. Carol Richardson. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. The lender intended to pursue repayment from me. My breathing became uneven. Emily touched my shoulder. "Mom." I handed her the letter. She read silently. Her face changed. "What does this mean?" I looked towards Thomas. He already knew. I could see it. He had seen this possibility coming long before any of us. "Thomas." He didn't answer. I stood up. "Did you know about this?" He rubbed his face. "I hoped it wouldn't happen." Michael stepped forward. "Dad." Thomas finally spoke. "The loan was under both names." I felt dizzy. "Because you signed my name?" He looked down. "Yes." I walked toward him. "Do you understand what you've done?" His voice cracked. "I was trying to save everything." "No." I could hear my own heartbeat. "You were willing to sacrifice me." The room became silent. No one moved. No one defended him. That hurt him more than anger. For the first time, his children had stopped protecting him. The following morning, I met with my attorney again. Her office overlooked the Savannah River. Normally, the view felt peaceful. That day, I barely noticed it. I handed her the letter. She read carefully. Then she removed her glasses. "Mrs. Richardson, we need to discuss your exposure." Exposure? Everything suddenly sounded like business language. Exposure. Liability. Assets. Debt. But behind those words stood my life. "What does this mean?" She folded her hands. "The creditor believes you are equally responsible." "But I didn't sign." "You may still have to prove that." I felt my stomach tighten. "How?" "Handwriting analysis, documentation, testimony." I looked out the window. I never imagined I would have to prove my husband forged my name. Her voice softened. "I know." "No, you don't." Tears began filling my eyes. "I trusted him." She remained silent, because there was nothing she could say. After a few moments, she spoke carefully. "There is something else." My heart sank. "What?" "Your retirement account." I looked at her. "What about it?" She opened another folder. Several withdrawals were made. The room suddenly felt cold. "What withdrawals?" Her expression changed. "Did you authorize them?" "No." She slid the papers toward me. I immediately recognized the account. My retirement savings. 30 years of work. Small deposits. Careful planning. Sacrifice. The balance had been reduced. Substantially. I stared at the numbers. Nearly $60,000. Gone. I could barely breathe. "Thomas." My attorney nodded. "It appears the funds were used as collateral." Collateral. Another terrible word. I left her office unable to think, unable to cry, unable to understand how my life had become legal documents and missing money. When I arrived home, Thomas sat alone in the living room. The house had become quiet during the previous week. The television remained off. The social media posts had stopped. No more photographs, no more expensive restaurants, no more motivational quotes. Only silence. I stood in front of him. My retirement. His eyes immediately closed. That answer told me everything. You took my retirement. I was going to replace it. When things improved, I laughed. For the first time. Not because anything was funny, because I couldn't believe those words still existed. When things improve. The same promise. Again and again. Years of lies built upon future miracles. I sat down opposite him. How much? He whispered. Almost 60,000? He nodded. I stared at him. 38 years. And now I realized something painful. My husband had not stolen from strangers. He had stolen from the person who loved him most. Emily came downstairs. She saw my face immediately. Mom? I couldn't answer. Thomas spoke. I used the retirement account. Emily froze. You what? I intended to pay it back. Her voice rose. With what money? He looked away. Michael entered moments later. Within minutes, the entire truth emerged. The retirement account, the additional loans, the missed mortgage payments, every remaining secret. Michael stood in complete disbelief. You emptied Mom's retirement. Thomas remained silent. Emily began crying again. I simply sat there. I had no tears left. Finally, Michael spoke quietly. Dad, why didn't you ask us? Thomas looked at his son. I didn't want help. Why? Because I didn't want my children seeing me fail. Michael's voice softened. You already succeeded. Thomas frowned. What? You raised us. Silence. You worked your whole life. Thomas lowered his head. You taught me honesty. That sentence hit every one of us, because honesty was exactly what had disappeared. Later that evening, Michael sat beside me on the porch. The air felt cool. The neighborhood was quiet. He asked a question I had avoided. Mom, are you staying with him? I didn't answer immediately, because for weeks I had been trying to save my marriage, trying to understand, trying to forgive. But every day brought another discovery, another debt, another lie, another signature. Finally, I said, I don't know. He nodded. You don't owe him your future. Those words stayed with me, because all my life I had believed marriage meant sacrifice, loyalty, commitment, standing beside someone during difficult times. But what happens when the difficult times exist because the person beside you deliberately created them? The next morning, I received a phone call. Danielle, I heard about the gala. News travels quickly. She hesitated. There may be something else you should know. My stomach tightened. What? She spoke carefully. Thomas was trying to attract investors. I know. No, Carol. Private investors. I sat down. What does that mean? He told several people he had opportunities. Opportunities for what? Real estate developments. I closed my eyes. Real estate. More lies. Did anyone give him money? Silence. Danielle. I think one person did. The room suddenly spun. How much? I don't know. I thanked her and hung up. When Thomas came downstairs, I asked immediately, "Did someone invest money with you?" His face lost color. He sat down. "Who told you? Is it true?" Several seconds passed. Then he nodded. 20,000. I felt physically ill. "Where is it?" he whispered. "Gone." I stared at the man sitting across from me, the man I had loved since I was 22, the father of my children, the builder of our home. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. This was bigger than debt, bigger than embarrassment, bigger than appearances. Thomas had created an entire world built upon lies, and every single day, that world was collapsing. But now, the collapse was reaching me. My credit, my retirement, my future. And as I sat there, listening to my husband admit yet another secret, a terrible thought entered my mind. Maybe saving my marriage would destroy my life. The thought stayed with me for 3 days. Maybe saving my marriage would destroy my life. I repeated those words while making coffee, while folding laundry, while lying awake beside an empty half of the bed. Thomas still slept in the guest room. Our children still occupied their old bedrooms, and our house had become something none of us recognized. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody planned anything. Every conversation eventually returned to money, debt, loans, attorneys. Not once during those days did Thomas mention love. Not once did he ask me how I was surviving any of this. He only asked questions like, "What did the lawyer say? Can they take the house? What happens next?" For the first time in our marriage, I realized that my husband and I were no longer trying to solve the same problem. He was trying to save his reputation. I was trying to save my future. On Tuesday morning, I met with a bankruptcy attorney. I never imagined those words would belong to my life. Bankruptcy. The office was small. The attorney, Margaret Ellis, looked to be around my age. She spoke kindly. That somehow made everything harder. After reviewing my documents, she leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Richardson, your situation is complicated." I laughed softly. "That's become a popular word." She smiled sadly. "Your husband created obligations that may legally affect you." "I know. You also have potential fraud claims." "I know." She folded her hands. "The question is whether you continue trying to save these debts together." I looked down. "And if I don't?" She hesitated. "You protect yourself." Again, that phrase, protect yourself. I finally asked the question I had been afraid to say aloud. "What happens if I don't?" Margaret answered gently. "If the debts continue growing, you could lose your retirement, your savings, and potentially your future income." The room became very quiet. "What would you do?" Attorneys rarely answer personal questions, but she did. "I would stop protecting someone who isn't protecting me." I drove home in complete silence. The streets of Savannah looked exactly the same. People walked dogs. Children rode bicycles. Couples sat outside restaurants. Meanwhile, my entire life felt like it was collapsing. When I entered the house, Michael sat at the kitchen table. He immediately knew something had happened. "Mom?" I sat down. "I saw a bankruptcy attorney." He remained silent. After a moment, he asked, "For you?" I nodded. His eyes filled with sadness. "Dad pushed you this far." I couldn't answer, because saying yes felt like betraying my husband. Even now. Even after everything. That evening, Emily arrived after work. Michael told her. She sat beside me. Mom, you don't have to carry this. I know. You've carried Dad your entire life. I looked at my daughter. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps I had spent decades protecting Thomas from disappointment, failure, embarrassment, and perhaps that protection had allowed him to avoid reality. Around 6 o'clock, Thomas came downstairs. The atmosphere changed immediately. Tension filled the room. He looked at Michael, at Emily, then at me. What's going on? I answered quietly. I met a bankruptcy attorney. He froze. What? I repeated it. His face became pale. No. I looked at him. No, you can't do that. Why not? It'll destroy everything. The irony nearly took my breath away. Destroy everything, as though everything had not already been destroyed. Michael stood. Dad. Thomas ignored him. He looked only at me. We can fix this. I asked the question that had haunted me. How? He opened his mouth, then closed it, because for the first time he had no answer. No future business deal, no investor, no opportunity, no promise, nothing, only debt. I stood. I've lost my retirement. I know. My credit is damaged. I know. Our children are devastated. His eyes filled with tears. I know. I finally said the words that had been building inside me for weeks. You cared more about strangers than your family. He shook his head. No. You cared more about looking successful than being honest. His voice cracked. I was trying to become someone. I looked at him. You already were. The room became silent. Thomas sat down heavily. For the first time, he looked old. Not 63, not tired, old. Like a man who had spent years running and suddenly realized he had no place left to go. Later that night, he knocked on the bedroom door. I almost didn't answer. When I opened it, he stood holding several folders. What is this? Everything. I looked at him. Everything? All the accounts. He handed them to me. Credit cards, loans, business statements, unpaid balances, past due notices, every secret, every lie, everything. I sat on the bed and began reading. The total amount nearly made me sick. More than $200,000. I looked up. How? His eyes were red. I kept thinking the next job would fix it. And when it didn't, I borrowed. And when that failed, I borrowed again. I closed the folders. The truth was finally complete. No more surprises. No more hidden accounts. No more secret loans. Just devastation. Thomas sat in the chair across from me. I can change. I looked at him. I know. I'll delete everything. I know. I'll sell the company. I know. Tears rolled down his face. Please don't do this. My own tears finally came because I still loved him. That was the terrible part. Love does not disappear simply because trust does. Love stays, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. I don't know how to save you, he whispered. Save us. I looked at the man I married, the man who built my first home, the father of my children, the man who had once sold his fishing boat to pay hospital bills. And I realized something heartbreaking. The man sitting before me had spent years trying to become someone else. In doing so, he had lost himself. The following morning, Michael entered the kitchen early. He placed an envelope in front of me. "What is this?" "My savings." I immediately pushed it back. "No. Mom. No." He looked at me. "If you need help, you have it." A few minutes later, Emily arrived. She did the same. "Stay with me if you need to." I started crying because my children were trying to save me, the same way I had spent decades trying to save their father. That afternoon, Thomas asked one final question. "If you file, it'll become public." I nodded. "Everyone will know." "Yes." "My business will be over." I looked directly into his eyes. "Our marriage almost ended because you cared too much about what everyone thinks." He lowered his head. I continued. "For the first time in my life, I don't." That evening, I sat alone on the porch. The sun disappeared behind the trees. The neighborhood lights slowly turned on. Inside the house, my children talked quietly. Thomas sat alone at the living room. And for the first time since all of this began, I made a decision. Not out of anger, not revenge, not punishment, survival. Because if I continued protecting my husband's lies, I would lose everything. But if I finally told the truth, I might lose my marriage and save my life. The decision did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in my kitchen. 3 days after I told Thomas I could no longer protect his lies, I woke before sunrise and sat alone at the table where we had shared thousands of meals. The house was silent. For years, this room had been the center of our family. Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, homework, coffee before church, late-night conversations. Now it had become the place where I counted debts. The stack of papers sat beside me. Loan statements, attorney letters, collection notices, retirement documents, mortgage warnings. Every piece of paper represented one decision Thomas had made without me. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, I asked myself a question I had avoided. What if I stopped saving him? The answer frightened me, because part of me still wanted to believe the man I married would somehow return, that he would fix everything, that he would wake up and become Thomas again. But reality had become stronger than hope. Around 7 o'clock, Thomas entered the kitchen. He looked exhausted. His hair had become grayer during the past few weeks. He sat across from me. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he said quietly, "I couldn't sleep." Neither could I. He looked at the papers. "Are those from the attorney?" I nodded. His hands trembled slightly. "What did she say?" I answered honestly. "She said I need to protect myself." He closed his eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he whispered, "Am I losing you?" The question broke my heart, because I realized he still believed this was about love. It wasn't. Not anymore. "I don't know." He nodded slowly. "I deserve that." I studied him carefully. For weeks, I had been angry, terrified, confused. But that morning, I saw something different. Shame. Real shame. Not embarrassment because people discovered the truth. Not fear about money. Shame because he had finally seen what he had done. "I never wanted to hurt you." I almost smiled. Nobody ever wants to hurt the people they love. They simply make choices that do. "You did." Tears appeared in his eyes. "I know." He looked around the kitchen. Our whole life happened here? I nodded. He continued. I remember when Emily spilled orange juice all over that floor. I smiled faintly. She was 6. And Michael broke the cabinet door. He was 8. He looked toward the window. I don't know when I became this person. For the first time, I believed him. Because perhaps he truly didn't know. Perhaps the lies had happened slowly. One compromise, one photograph, one loan, one excuse. Until eventually, he no longer recognized himself. But understanding why someone hurts you does not erase the damage. Later that afternoon, my attorney called. Mrs. Richardson, we need to discuss timing. I sat in the bedroom while Emily listened quietly nearby. Timing, if you intend to file separately delaying, may increase your exposure. The words felt clinical. Exposure, protection, assets. But beneath the legal language was something deeply personal. My marriage. When would I need to decide? Very soon. After the call ended, Emily sat beside me. Mom. I looked at her. Do you remember when Dad taught me to ride a bike? I smiled. He ran beside you for an hour. She nodded. He never let go until he knew I could do it myself. Tears filled her eyes. I miss that, Dad. So do I. She took my hand. But Mom, you can't drown trying to save him. Those words stayed with me. That evening, Michael gathered everyone in the living room. No television, no distractions, only family. He looked at his father. Dad, we need honesty. Thomas nodded. I know. No more promises. Again, he nodded. Michael continued. Mom may file. The room became very quiet. Thomas looked down. I understand. Emily started crying. I reached for her hand. Thomas finally spoke. I don't blame you. I looked at him. He continued quietly. If our situations were reversed, I don't know if I could stay. Those words surprised me. For weeks, he had fought reality, denied responsibility, made excuses. Now, for the first time, he seemed to accept the truth. Michael asked softly, Why didn't you stop? Thomas sat silently for nearly a minute. When he finally answered, his voice trembled. Because every time someone admired me, I felt important. Nobody interrupted. I felt successful. His eyes filled with tears. And every time I came home, I felt like a failure. I frowned. Why? He looked directly at me. Because you deserved better. I couldn't speak. He continued. You worked your whole life. You sacrificed everything. You trusted me. He lowered his head. And I felt like I hadn't given you enough. Tears rolled down my cheeks. Because in some twisted way, his lies had begun with love. Misguided, broken, damaging, but love. I didn't need money. His voice cracked. I know that now. After dinner, Thomas asked if we could walk outside. We hadn't taken a walk together in months. The neighborhood felt quiet. Streetlights glowed. Summer air moved through the trees. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, I deleted everything. What? My accounts. I looked at him. The social media. The pictures. The followers. Everything. I felt sadness, not relief, because those accounts had become his entire identity, and now they were gone. What happens now? He laughed softly. I don't know. We stopped beside the old oak tree near our house, the same tree where he once taught Michael baseball. He looked at me. I would give anything to go back. I answered honestly, so would I. But time only moves one direction. He reached into his pocket. Slowly, he removed his wedding ring. My heart stopped. What are you doing? He placed it in my hand. I don't deserve this right now. I stared at the ring. 38 years. Anniversaries. Children. Promises. Life. Thomas. No. His voice trembled. You shouldn't have to carry me anymore. Tears ran down both our faces. Because sometimes the saddest moment in a marriage is not anger. It is surrender. When we returned home, everyone had gone to bed. I sat alone in our bedroom holding his ring. And for the first time since all of this began, I stopped asking whether my husband loved me. He did. He always had. The tragedy was that somewhere along the way, he had begun believing that love required success, that a man needed wealth to deserve respect, that appearances mattered more than honesty, and those beliefs had destroyed us. The next morning, my attorney called again. We're ready if you choose to proceed. I looked out the window. Thomas sat alone on the porch, the man who had once built my house, the man who had nearly destroyed it. I closed my eyes. And finally, after weeks of fear, I made my decision. Not against my husband, not out of revenge, but for myself. Because sometimes saving your own life is the hardest act of love you will ever perform. The day I filed for bankruptcy began with rain. Savannah rarely receives the kind of cold rain that makes everything feel gray. But that morning, the sky seemed determined to match my heart. I woke before dawn. The house was quiet. Thomas was asleep in the guest room. Emily and Michael had both stayed another night because neither of them wanted me to face the day alone. I walked into the kitchen and made coffee. For nearly 40 years, every important moment in my marriage had begun in this room. The children leaving for college, deaths, births, financial struggles, anniversaries. And now this, public bankruptcy. I still hated the words. Around 6 o'clock, Michael entered the kitchen. He looked at me for several seconds. You don't have to do this. I smiled sadly. I do. He sat beside me. Are you sure? No, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure about anything anymore. Not my future, not my marriage, not my home, not even myself. But I was certain of one thing. I could no longer carry Thomas's lies. Emily came downstairs a few minutes later. She wrapped her arms around me. You don't have to be brave today. Her words nearly broke me. Because women my age spend decades being brave. We raise children, care for parents, support husbands, endure disappointments, and somewhere along the way, people begin expecting strength from us. But strength becomes exhausting. At 7 o'clock, Thomas entered the kitchen. He looked terrible. He had barely eaten for days. The confident businessman from social media had completely disappeared. Only my husband remained. He sat down across from me. Nobody spoke. Finally, he said quietly, "You still have time to stop." I looked at him. "And then what?" His eyes filled with tears. "I'll figure something out." I shook my head. "No more promises." He lowered his head. "No more promises." For several minutes, we simply sat together. Not husband and wife, not enemies, just two broken people mourning the same life. As I prepared to leave, Thomas stood. "I'll go with you." I looked surprised. "Why?" His voice trembled. "Because you're still my wife." The drive to the courthouse felt longer than it was. Rain struck the windshield. Michael drove. Emily sat beside me. Thomas sat quietly in the back seat. Nobody spoke. The courthouse parking lot contained several television vans. Apparently, one local reporter had discovered the filing. My attorney had warned me. Public records become public stories. Thomas noticed the cameras. His entire body became rigid. "Oh, God." The words barely escaped his mouth. For 2 years, he had desperately wanted public attention. Now he had it, and it terrified him. Inside the courthouse, my attorney greeted me. Margaret looked calm, professional. She quietly explained the process, the documents, the hearing, the questions. I listened, but part of me felt detached, as though I were watching another woman's life. Then I saw Thomas standing alone near the window, and suddenly reality returned. This was my husband, the man who once danced with me in our kitchen, the man who carried our daughter into the hospital, the man who built our home with his own hands. And today, I was about to publicly separate my future from his decisions. The hearing itself lasted less than an hour. Yet those minutes changed everything. The judge reviewed documents, asked questions, verified debts, confirmed signatures. My attorney explained the financial exposure. The courtroom remained mostly quiet, but several reporters sat near the back. Thomas stared at the floor. Then the judge asked me a question. "Mrs. Richardson, are you filing voluntarily?" My throat tightened. Every eye in the room seemed to focus on me. I looked toward Thomas. His face was pale. His eyes were filled with sadness. For one brief moment, I wanted to say no. I wanted to stand, take his hand, go home, pretend none of this had happened, but reality had already destroyed those options. I answered quietly, "Yes." The judge nodded. The hearing continued, and with every document discussed, another piece of our private life became public. The loans, the debts, the forged signatures, the retirement account, the mortgage, everything. Thomas remained silent. The hearing ended shortly before noon. As we stepped outside, reporters approached. Questions immediately began. "Mrs. Richardson, did your husband know? Was the wealth fake? How much debt exists?" I froze. Margaret stepped forward. But before she could speak, Thomas suddenly exploded. "This didn't need to happen." Everyone became silent. He looked at me. Tears filled his eyes. "You could have kept this private." For a moment, the entire world disappeared. The cameras, the courthouse, the reporters, everything. Only my husband remained, the man who still believed secrecy would save us, the man who still feared humiliation more than truth. I looked directly at him and quietly said, "There was nothing left to protect." The reporters wrote. The cameras rolled. Thomas looked devastated. Emily immediately stood beside me. Michael moved toward his father. But Thomas stepped away from everyone. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, he sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse. I walked toward him. The rain had stopped. The air felt strangely calm. He looked up at me. I lost everything. I sat beside him. No. He frowned. What? You lost an image. Tears rolled down his face. My business is finished. Maybe. People will know. I nodded. Yes. He looked at me. I was so afraid of being a failure. I spoke softly. You became one only when you stopped telling the truth. He covered his face, and for the first time since all of this began, he cried openly. Not because reporters were watching, not because money was gone, because the illusion had finally died. That evening, local news stations reported the story. Neighbors called. Church friends sent messages. Some people expressed sympathy. Others expressed shock. Many simply wanted gossip. Thomas sat in the living room while the television played. A reporter described the case. Mentioned financial deception. Mentioned bankruptcy. Mentioned public filings. The camera briefly showed our family leaving the courthouse. Thomas turned off the television. The room became silent. After several minutes, he whispered, "They all know now." I sat beside him. Yes? He looked at me. Are you relieved? I thought carefully. The answer surprised me. Yes, because for the first time in 2 years, I no longer had to participate in the lie. No more pretending, no more wealthy dinners, no more social media, no more false success. Only truth. Painful truth, but truth. That night before going upstairs, Thomas stopped beside me. His voice barely emerged. I'm sorry. I looked at him. Not the businessman, not the liar, not the man chasing strangers. Just Thomas, the man I had loved. And I realized something difficult. I could forgive him, but forgiveness and rescue were not the same thing. The next morning, the telephone began ringing. Business clients, former friends, church members, people who had once admired Thomas. One by one, they disappeared. And for the first time in his life, my husband would have to discover who he was without the applause. The house became very quiet after the bankruptcy filing. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of silence that settles over people who have finally run out of things to say. The telephone no longer rang as often. The reporters disappeared after several days. Church friends stopped asking questions. Neighbors avoided looking directly at our house. For nearly 2 years, Thomas had built a life around attention. Now he had none. And I quickly discovered that silence frightened him far more than criticism. One morning, I found him sitting on the back porch. No phone, no laptop, no social media, just coffee. The same way he used to sit 20 years earlier. For several minutes, I watched him through the kitchen window. He looked smaller, not physically, emotionally, as though the version of himself he had created had finally died, leaving behind only the man underneath. I stepped outside. He looked up. Morning. Morning? We sat quietly. Birds moved through the trees. The neighborhood slowly woke. After several minutes, Thomas spoke. I called the company. I looked at him. What company? My business. What about it? He stared into his coffee. I'm closing it. The words surprised me. His construction company had been his entire identity for 40 years. He had built it from nothing. Worked weekends, missed vacations, taken risks, survived recessions, and now it was ending. Next month. I didn't know what to say. He continued quietly. I can't keep pretending. No, he couldn't. That afternoon, Michael returned to Dallas. Emily went back to work. The house belonged to only Thomas and me again. For the first time in weeks, we were alone. The distance between us felt enormous. Not anger, not hatred, something worse. Uncertainty. That evening, Thomas knocked on my bedroom door. I still slept alone. He still used the guest room. Can we talk? I nodded. He sat carefully in the chair beside the window. His hands shook slightly. I sold the watch. I remembered the expensive watch, the first lie, the first symbol. How much? Not much. And the money went to the mortgage. I nodded. I sold the golf membership. Another symbol, another illusion. And the furniture contracts, the suits, the car lease. Every sentence felt like a funeral. Because he wasn't selling objects, he was burying the life he had created. He finally looked at me. I don't know who I am anymore. The honesty in his voice frightened me, because men his age often define themselves through work, success, status, income. Thomas had lost all of those. I asked softly, "Who were you before all this?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "Your husband." Tears filled my eyes, because somewhere beneath the lies, he was still there. The following Sunday, something unexpected happened. Thomas asked if we could go to church. We had not attended in nearly 3 months, partly because of embarrassment, partly because of gossip, partly because neither of us had the strength. I hesitated. People will talk. He nodded. They already are, so we went. Walking into church felt harder than entering the courthouse. These people knew us. They had watched our children grow up, celebrated anniversaries, attended family dinners. Some knew about the bankruptcy. Others had seen the news. Several had followed Thomas online. As we entered, conversations briefly stopped. Then people smiled. Some hugged us. Some avoided difficult subjects. Others quietly said, "We've been praying." After the service, Pastor Allen approached. He was nearly 70, a widower, a man who had known us for decades. He looked at Thomas. "Would you walk with me?" Thomas nodded. The two men disappeared toward the garden behind the church. Nearly 40 minutes passed. When Thomas returned, his eyes were red. "What happened?" He smiled weakly. He asked me why I thought God cared about money. I remained silent. He said pride destroys more men than poverty. We drove home quietly. For the first time in many weeks, Thomas looked calmer. Not happy, but calmer. That evening, he carried several boxes into the living room. "What's this?" He opened one. Photographs, old family albums, home videos, school projects, children's drawings. For hours, we sat together. Emily's first piano recital, Michael's baseball uniform, camping trips, Christmas mornings, a photograph of our first apartment, our wedding. Thomas laughed softly. We had nothing. I smiled. We thought we had everything. He looked at me. We did. The room became quiet, because perhaps that was the great tragedy. We had already possessed everything he spent years trying to imitate: love, children, security, respect, home. He had simply stopped seeing it. A few days later, I received a call from my attorney. Some debts would likely be discharged. Others required negotiation. The house might be saved. The retirement issue remained complicated, but for the first time in months, the news wasn't entirely terrible. When I hung up, I found Thomas in the garage. He was organizing tools he had not touched for nearly 2 years. The old Thomas, the builder, the carpenter, the man who repaired everything himself. "What are you doing?" He smiled faintly. "Mr. Wilson next door needs help fixing his fence." "You're doing construction again?" He shook his head. "No." "What then?" He answered quietly. "Helping." The next several weeks brought small changes. Thomas stopped wearing expensive clothes. He began walking every morning. He visited his elderly mother more often. He helped neighbors. He repaired things around the house. The phones rarely rang. The business world had disappeared. The followers had vanished. The admiration was gone. And strangely, he seemed lighter. Not healed, but lighter. One evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset. He spoke softly. "Do you remember our first apartment?" I laughed. "The leaking ceiling and the broken heater? We had lawn chairs instead of furniture." He smiled. "And you said we'd make it." I looked at him. "You didn't believe me." "No." "Do you now?" He became quiet. For several seconds, only the sound of cicadas filled the air. Finally, he asked the question I had known was coming. "Do you still love me?" I closed my eyes, because love had never disappeared. It had simply become buried beneath fear, betrayal, debt, pain. When I finally answered, my voice trembled. "Yes." His eyes filled with tears. "But love isn't enough." He nodded. "I know. And trust doesn't come back because you apologize." "I know." The silence that followed felt honest. Not comfortable, but honest. Before going inside, he said quietly, "I'll spend the rest of my life earning it if I have to." I didn't answer, because I didn't know. I still didn't know whether our marriage would survive, whether our future existed, whether forgiveness could rebuild what deception destroyed. But for the first time in many months, I could finally see the man I married. Not the businessman, not the influencer, not the stranger. Thomas. And perhaps that was where healing had to begin. Yet the greatest test of our marriage still remained, because saving our home would require one final sacrifice, and neither of us yet knew who would have to make it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. By then, nearly 6 weeks had passed since the bankruptcy filing. Life had become strangely quiet. Not normal. I wasn't sure normal would ever return, but the constant emergencies had finally slowed. The phones no longer rang every hour. The reporters had moved on. Most of the legal paperwork had been filed. And Thomas had settled into a routine that reminded me of the man I had married decades earlier. He woke early, walked through the neighborhood, helped neighbors repair fences and porches, visited his mother, worked with his hands. He never mentioned followers, never mentioned business opportunities, never talked about success. The illusion had died, but the consequences remained. I found the letter in the mailbox while returning from work. For the first time in months, I had begun taking additional hours at the law office. I needed income, structure, something that belonged entirely to me. The envelope carried the mortgage company's name. My hands immediately became cold. Inside was a proposal, a restructuring agreement, a final opportunity. If certain conditions could be met, foreclosure might be avoided. I sat in the kitchen and read every page. Several debts had been included in the bankruptcy process. Others remained. The house could potentially be saved, but only if substantial changes happened. When Thomas came home, I handed him the documents. He read quietly. Finally, he looked up. "They want us to sell." I nodded. The house, our home, the place where our children grew up. The place where 40 years of marriage lived inside every wall. Thomas sat down. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then quietly, "They're right." The answer surprised me. I had expected resistance, arguments, promises. Instead, I saw acceptance. "We can't afford it anymore." I looked around the kitchen. The faded cabinets, the old clock, the scratches on the table. How many dinners had happened here? How many birthdays? How many ordinary moments had become memories? That evening, we called Emily and Michael. Both came the following weekend. For the first time in months, our family sat together without discussing lawsuits or debt. Instead, we discussed the house. Emily cried. Michael walked from room to room. Thomas remained mostly silent. Finally, Emily spoke. "This house isn't the family." No one answered. She continued. "We are." I looked at my daughter. At 36, she sounded wiser than I had ever been. Later that evening, Michael stood beside his father in the garage. I overheard only part of the conversation. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "You don't have to prove anything anymore." Thomas nodded. "I know." "No more pretending." "I know." Michael hesitated. "I miss you." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Thomas began crying. Real tears. Not the tears of embarrassment, not the tears of losing money. The tears of a father hearing that his son still loved him. The following week, we met with a realtor. Walking through my own house as someone discussed square footage and market value felt surreal. "This room photographs beautifully. Buyers love natural light. This neighborhood is desirable." The words felt almost offensive. This wasn't property. This was our life. After the realtor left, I sat alone in the living room. The same room where Thomas had once hosted his fake wealthy dinners. The same room where creditors had called. Where our children had cried. Where lies had collapsed. Thomas entered quietly. He sat beside me. "I ruined this place for you." I looked around. "No." He seemed surprised. "I almost lost it." I nodded. "But this house saw everything." "What do you mean? Our children grew up here. You built it. We survived here." Tears filled his eyes. "And we broke here." "Yes." For the first time, neither of us tried to deny reality. A few days later, I made another decision. I rented a small apartment across town. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a balcony overlooking a parking lot. Nothing special, nothing impressive. The rent fit my income. The place belonged to me. When I told Emily, she cried. When I told Michael, he supported me. When I told Thomas, he simply nodded. "I understand." His calmness hurt more than anger, because we both knew what this meant. Not divorce, not yet, but separation, space, time, perhaps survival. The day I moved, Thomas carried every box. Neither of us spoke very much. The apartment looked tiny compared to our house, but strangely, I felt peaceful. No pretending, no expectations, no performance. Just a small place that belonged to me. After the final box was inside, Thomas stood near the door. "I never imagined this." "Neither did I." He looked around. "You deserve better." I shook my head. "No." He frowned. "I deserve honesty." His eyes filled again. "I wish I could go back." I smiled sadly. "So do I." Before leaving, he reached into his pocket. A folded envelope. "What's this?" "A letter?" I looked at him. "Why not say it?" He lowered his eyes. "Because I spent 2 years talking." He handed me the envelope. "This one is the truth." He left. I sat alone in my small apartment. The silence felt different here. Not lonely, peaceful. I finally opened the letter. The handwriting shook. "Carol, I spent years trying to become a man I thought the world would respect. I forgot that the only people whose opinions mattered already loved me. I thought money made men valuable. I thought success made men worthy. I thought strangers could tell me who I was. I was wrong. The richest years of my life were the years when we had nothing. Our first apartment, our first house, our children, the front porch, Sunday mornings. I traded real wealth for applause, and I nearly lost the only person who ever believed in me. You deserved truth. You deserved safety. You deserved better. If you never come back, I will understand. If you forgive me, I will spend whatever years I have left earning it. You once told me that ordinary lives could still be beautiful. I finally believe you. I love you. Thomas." I read the letter 3 times. Then I cried harder than I had cried during the bankruptcy. Because somewhere beneath the lies, the debt, and the humiliation, my husband had finally become honest. Not successful, not impressive, not admired, just honest. The following morning, I stood on my small balcony drinking coffee. The sun rose above the city. Cars moved below. Life continued. For the first time in many months, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Not hope that everything would return to the way it had been. It couldn't. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. But perhaps something new could still be built. Something smaller. Something quieter. Something real. And for the first time since the courtroom, I no longer feared the future. Because losing the illusion of wealth had finally forced all of us to discover what truly mattered. The first Christmas after the bankruptcy felt impossible. For most of my adult life, Christmas had belonged to our house. The same tree in the living room, the same ornaments, the same dining table, the same traditions. Thomas hanging lights, Emily baking cookies, Michael carrying boxes from the attic. But the house had been sold in early November, not because we wanted to let it go, because reality finally demanded it. The sale prevented foreclosure. Several remaining debts were resolved. The money did not make us wealthy. It simply allowed us to breathe. Thomas rented a small cottage outside Savannah. I remained in my apartment. For the first time since 1985, we lived separately. That fact still hurt. Some mornings, I reached for him before remembering he wasn't there. Some evenings, I wanted to call him after work. 38 years cannot be erased by paperwork. Love leaves habits behind, and habits become loneliness. The weeks before Christmas were quiet. Thomas never pressured me, never asked me to return, never spoke about the marriage. Instead, he rebuilt his life one day at a time. He worked part-time for another contractor. He repaired decks, installed cabinets, fixed fences. The wealthy businessman disappeared forever. The carpenter returned. One afternoon, Emily called. "Mom." "Yes. We're having Christmas dinner at our house." I smiled. "That's wonderful." There was a pause. "I invited Dad." Of course she had. "He said he'll come if you're comfortable." The question sat between us. Was I comfortable? I honestly didn't know. Months earlier, I couldn't imagine sitting beside him. Now, I found myself missing him. Not the man who lied, the man who used to laugh in our kitchen, the man who built our first bookshelf, the man who danced with me while washing dishes. "I'll come." Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Emily's home glowed with lights. The smell of cinnamon filled the kitchen. Grandchildren ran through the hallway. For the first time in over a year, our family looked whole. Then the front door opened. Thomas entered quietly. He wore an old sweater, no expensive watch, no designer clothes, no image, just Thomas. The room became still. He looked older, but somehow lighter. Emily hugged him. Michael shook his hand. The grandchildren ran toward him, and for several seconds nobody mentioned debt, or bankruptcy, or the past. We simply became a family again. Dinner felt strangely normal. People laughed. Stories were shared. The grandchildren opened presents. Michael talked about work. Emily discussed her students. For a few hours, the pain disappeared. After dinner, Thomas and I stepped outside. Snow never visits Savannah often, but the air felt cold enough to remind us that winter had arrived. Christmas lights glowed across the neighborhood. He stood beside me quietly. Finally, he spoke. "I never thought we'd reach this day." I smiled softly. "Neither did I." He looked at the sky. "I almost lost everything." I answered honestly. "You did lose a lot." He nodded. "My business. My house. My reputation." I looked at him. "But not your children." Tears appeared in his eyes. "And not you." I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. Had he lost me? Partly. Had I left him? Yes. Had our marriage survived? I wasn't certain. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket. Another letter. I almost laughed. "You've become a writer." He smiled. "I say things better on paper." I accepted the envelope. "I won't ask you to come home." He looked directly at me. "I won't ask you to forgive me today." His voice trembled. "But I wanted you to know something." "What?" He took a breath. "For 40 years, I thought my job was providing money." Tears filled his eyes. "But it was loving my family." I couldn't speak. He continued. "I forgot that." I finally asked the question that had remained inside me. "Why did you care so much about being rich?" He stood silently for several seconds. Then he answered. "Because I was afraid." "Of what?" His voice broke. "That one day, you would realize you deserved someone better." The words stunned me. After everything, after the lies, after the bankruptcy, after the humiliation, his deepest fear had been losing me, and in trying to prevent that, he nearly caused it. I stepped closer. "Thomas." He looked up. "I never wanted a rich husband." A tear rolled down his cheek. "I know. I wanted you." He closed his eyes. "I know." For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said the truth. I forgive you. He opened his eyes. The emotion on his face almost broke my heart. But forgiveness isn't the same as going backward. He nodded slowly. I understand. Because some marriages survive betrayal by rebuilding. Not by pretending nothing happened. Not by erasing the pain. But by building something entirely new. When we returned inside, Emily was crying. Michael was laughing. The grandchildren were opening gifts. Life had continued. Despite debt, despite shame, despite failure. As the evening ended, Thomas helped wash dishes. Something he had always done. At one point, Emily smiled. Dad's back. He looked at her. No. She frowned. What? He smiled gently. I'm finally here. Several weeks later, I visited the old neighborhood. Our former house belonged to another family. Children played in the yard. The porch had been painted. The curtains changed. At first, I expected sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude. Because houses are not memories, people are. I drove home to my apartment. A small place. A simple life. No luxury, no image, no pretending. On my kitchen shelf sat a framed photograph. Thomas and me. 25 years old, standing outside our first apartment. We owned almost nothing, yet our faces looked rich. That evening, Thomas called. Not to discuss money, not to discuss lawyers, not to discuss debt. He simply asked, "How was your day?" We spoke for nearly an hour, about weather, work, Emily, the grandchildren, ordinary things, the things that had once made up our entire life. When I hung up, I realized something. I did not know whether we would ever live together again. I did not know whether our marriage would fully heal. Some wounds require years, perhaps longer. But I knew this. The lies had ended. The performance had ended. The illusion had ended. And maybe for the first time in many years, we were finally telling each other the truth. As I turned off the kitchen light, I remembered something Thomas once wrote in his letter. The richest years of my life were the years when we had nothing. And I finally understood my own answer. Losing the illusion of wealth was the first time I truly became rich. Sometimes, the truth cost us everything we thought we needed. Carol lost her home, her comfort, her reputation, and the marriage she once believed was unbreakable. But in losing the illusion, she found something far more valuable: peace. She learned that love cannot survive on lies, and a family cannot be protected by pretending everything is fine. A beautiful house means nothing if fear lives inside it. A public image means nothing if the people closest to you are being hurt in private. And wealth means nothing if it costs you your dignity. For every woman who has spent years protecting someone else's pride, this story is a reminder you are allowed to protect yourself too. You are allowed to stop carrying secrets that are destroying you. You are allowed to choose truth, even when truth is painful. Starting over at 60 is not failure. It is courage. It is survival. It is self-respect. Carol did not become rich because she kept a mansion, a marriage, or a perfect reputation. She became rich because she finally had peace, honesty, and the strength to live without pretending. If this story touched your heart, please let me know in the comments. Do you think Carol did the right thing by filing publicly? Or should she have protected Thomas one more time? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your stories and voices make this community feel like family.